The trunk sat open at the foot of the bed. Dresses, letters, a velvet jewelry box, all of it folded with quiet precision, as if each piece had already said its goodbyes to the room it once knew. Lady Isadora Pemberton, Duchess of Wycliffe, did not cry. She pressed her lips together, lifted the last silk gown from the chair, and placed it carefully inside without a sound. Her hands were steady, her chin was up. Only the faint line between her brows betrayed what it had cost her to reach this decision. She was leaving. Not in anger, not in a storm of accusations and broken vows, but in the most devastating way a woman can leave a man, quietly and without looking back. 3 floors below, in the cold study that smelled of old leather and cedarwood, the Duke of Wycliffe, Lord Dorian Mercer, sat behind his desk with a letter in his hand. He read it twice, then a third time, and still the words refused to settle. I have fulfilled every obligation this marriage required of me. I ask nothing more from you than I have already given. I shall be gone before morning. He placed the letter on the desk, slowly, the way a man sets something down when his hands are not entirely trustworthy. It was just an arrangement, a contract. Nothing more than ink on paper and a title exchanged for a fortune. He had told himself that on the morning of their wedding. He repeated it every single evening since. But then why? Why did the room feel colder than it ever had before? Before we continue this story, I want to ask you something. From which country are you listening tonight? Leave your answer in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about dukes, secrets, and love that surprises even the most guarded of hearts, subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories waiting for you. It had all begun 14 months ago. Wycliffe Manor was one of the oldest estates in England. Its stone walls had stood through centuries of war, harvest, and grief. But walls, no matter how ancient, cannot survive debts. And the debts of the Mercer family grew in silence for years, fed by a father who loved card tables more than ledgers, and by a reputation that still carried weight in society even as the coffers ran dry. Dorian inherited both, the title and the ruin. He was not a man who asked for help. His jaw was set, his pride iron, and his family name too old to be spoken with anything less than respect. But respect alone could not repair a crumbling roof or settle what was owed to half of London. He had 3 months before the estate would have to be sold. It was his solicitor, Mr. Hale, who first mentioned the name Pemberton. The late Lord Pemberton's inheritance, the man said carefully, testing each word before he released it. It passed entirely to his daughter, Miss Isadora Pemberton. She is of age, unmarried, and, from what I understand, in need of a suitable name to protect what she has. Her family's fortune is considerable, Your Grace, more than enough to restore Wycliffe Manor entirely. Dorian said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the window. The garden outside was bare. November had stripped the last of the leaves from the old oak near the gate, and the branches stretched across the grey sky like something that had given up waiting. Then, arrange a meeting. He told himself it was simply good sense, a practical solution to a practical problem. Emotion had no place in decisions of this nature. He had learned that lesson young enough that it had settled into his bones and stayed there, quietly, permanently, the way cold settles into old stone. When he met Isadora for the first time, she sat across from him in a drawing room that smelled of fresh roses and old money. She wore a deep blue gown, her dark hair pinned with quiet elegance, and she looked at him the way a woman looks at a document she is not entirely sure she can trust, carefully, without flinching. She did not flatter him. She did not look away. She simply said, "I assume you have read the terms my solicitor proposed, Your Grace." "I have." "And?" "They are acceptable." She held his gaze a half-second longer than was polite. "Good. Then we understand each other." He respected that in a distant sort of way. She knew exactly what this was, a trade, his name for her fortune, a duchess title for a rescued estate. Clean, honest, no illusions on either side. Their wedding took place on a grey October morning. The church was full of society names, all of them watching with the quiet hunger of people who sense a story worth telling. Dorian stood at the altar in a dark coat with gold buttons, his expression unreadable. Isadora walked toward him in ivory silk, her bouquet of white roses steady in her hands, her eyes fixed ahead. When she reached him, she did not smile, neither did he. The vows were spoken clearly, correctly, and without feeling. The ring was placed, the register was signed, and by noon, Lady Isadora Pemberton had become the Duchess of Wycliffe, wife of a man who had married her the way one acquires a necessary piece of property. She knew it. He knew she knew it. And in some cold, unspoken agreement, they each decided that honesty was simpler than pretending otherwise. The first weeks at Wycliffe Manor were a study in polite distance. Isadora took her role seriously, more seriously perhaps than anyone expected. She reviewed the household accounts in her first week. She spoke with the housekeeper and learned the name of every person under that roof before the month was out. She walked the estate at dawn, before the morning fog lifted from the fields, and spent her evenings in the library with ledgers and letters spread across the reading table. She did not complain. She did not seek his attention. She simply lived there with a quiet efficiency that made the old manor feel, for the first time in years, as though someone was genuinely looking after it. Dorian noticed. He could not help but notice, but he said nothing. Their dinners were formal, brief, and largely silent. He asked about the estate. She answered. She occasionally asked about the repairs to the East Wing. He provided a progress report. By all appearances, they were two people who managed a property together, with professional courtesy and absolutely nothing more. It was exactly what they had agreed to. And for a long time it felt like enough. What Dorian did not expect, what no contract could have prepared him for, was the particular quality of her silence. Most people, when they said nothing, left a kind of empty space. Isadora's silence was different. It had weight. It stayed in a room long after she left it. He would find himself at his desk an hour after dinner, still aware of it, the way she had looked at the fire during the meal. Her glass held lightly between her fingers, something moving behind her eyes that she never put into words. He told himself he did not wonder what she was thinking. He told himself that every night, and every night the lie became a little less convincing. Now 14 months after they signed a contract that was supposed to be simple, Dorian Mercer sat in his study with her letter on the desk before him and a silence above him that felt entirely unlike the ones that came before. Through the ceiling, faint, deliberate, unmistakable, he heard it. The soft final sound of a trunk being closed. He did not move. He should have felt nothing. This was, after all, the arrangement they had made. No claims beyond the practical ones, no obligations beyond duty and honor. If she wished to leave, she was well within her rights. Every line of their agreement permitted it. He knew that. He sat perfectly still, his fingers flat on the desk, his eyes on the letter. And for the first time in 14 months, the Duke of Wycliffe had absolutely no idea what to do next. Dorian did not go upstairs that night. He stayed at his desk until the last candle burned low, the wax pooling slow and silent around the brass holder, and the fire in the grate faded from amber to grey ash. He did not call for more wood. He did not ring for tea. He simply sat in the growing dark, the letter still open before him, and listened to the manor settle around him the way old houses do, with creaks and sighs that sound almost human in the quiet. Above him, he heard nothing more. No footsteps, no doors, no voice calling for a servant to carry the trunk down the stairs. She was waiting for morning just as she had written. Isadora Pemberton, his wife, his duchess, the woman whose fortune had saved every stone of this house, was upstairs with her bags packed, counting down the hours until she could leave with her dignity intact. And Dorian Mercer sat below, unable to explain, even to himself, why his chest felt the way it did. He pressed 2 fingers against his jaw. A habit, something he did when a thought arrived that he had not invited. It is simply inconvenient, he told himself. A disruption, nothing more. He was good at that, at finding the rational word for an irrational feeling and pinning it down before it could move. He had practiced it for 11 years. He had, by now, become rather excellent at it. It began with a woman named Charlotte Voss. He was 23 when he met her. She was the daughter of a viscount, graceful, warm, the kind of woman who laughed easily and made a room feel lighter simply by entering it. He was not a man who fell easily, but Charlotte had a way of sitting beside him in the garden and saying nothing at all, and somehow that silence had felt entirely different from every silence that came after. He asked for her hand in the spring. Her father agreed. The engagement was announced at a dinner in late April, and Dorian, for perhaps the only time in his adult life, allowed himself to believe that something was going to go exactly as he hoped. The wedding was set for September. In August, he received a letter. Charlotte wrote it herself. He recognized her handwriting, the slight lean to the right, the way she always pressed the quill too hard on the first letter of a sentence. The letter was 4 pages long, but its meaning fit in a single line. She had fallen in love with someone else. A younger son. A man without a title, without an estate, without anything that society would consider a suitable match. She chose him anyway. Dorian read the letter once, folded it, placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk beneath a stack of old estate ledgers, where it remained untouched for 11 years. He told no one what he felt, not his solicitor, not his closest friend, not his mother, who watched him through that autumn with eyes that asked a question she was too careful to speak aloud. He arrived at every social obligation on time, dressed correctly and spoke when spoken to. He was, by every visible measure, entirely fine. And, in a way, the way that matters to a man who has decided that feeling things is simply not worth the cost. He was. He closed a door inside himself that August, quietly, efficiently, the way he did most things. He decided that love was a sentiment best left to people who had the luxury of surviving it. He had a title to protect, an estate to manage, and a name that carried 3 centuries of expectation. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. When the time came to marry, when the debts finally demanded it, he chose with his head. He looked for a woman who understood the terms, who would not expect what he no longer had to give. He found Isadora Pemberton. She had been exactly what he expected, and somehow, in a way he had never prepared for, she had also been entirely different. Not in the obvious ways. She did not try to charm him. She did not attempt the warm, careful closeness that Charlotte once had, the kind that arrived with soft words and searching eyes, and the particular hope of a woman who believes she can open what has been closed. Isadora had never tried to open him. She simply existed in his space with a composure so complete that it asked nothing of him at all. That should have made it easy. It had made it, instead, profoundly complicated. Because a woman who asks nothing of you cannot be kept at a distance the way a woman who wants something can. There is no resistance to push against, no expectation to deflect. Isadora moved through Wycliffe Manor like the winter light, quietly present, touching everything without grasping at anything, and leaving the rooms somehow different after she passed through them. He noticed once that she had moved a vase of dried flowers from the hallway and replaced them with fresh ones from the east garden. He said nothing. But when he walked past that spot the following morning and caught the faint scent of lavender in the air, he stopped for exactly 2 seconds longer than he should have. He noticed another time that she had left a book on the armchair beside the fire in the library. Open, face down, the spine creased from use. A collection of letters between a French poet and a botanist. He had no reason to pick it up. He picked it up. He read 3 pages standing before he realized what he was doing and set it back down exactly as he found it. He did not ask her about the book. But that evening at dinner, when the silence between them settled in its usual way, he found himself glancing at her hands around her wineglass and thinking, for just a moment before he stopped himself, that he would have liked to know what she thought of it. Now he sat in the dark, with her letter on the desk and that thought somewhere behind his ribs where he could not quite reach it. The rational word, he decided, was adjustment. Her departure would require an adjustment. The household would need to be reorganized. The account she managed would need a new hand. There would be questions from society, from his solicitor, from the staff who had quietly come to rely on her steady, unhurried presence. It was a practical problem. He was very good at practical problems. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him, uncapped the ink and held the quill above the page. He sat like that for a long time. The quill did not move. Somewhere above him, past the stone ceiling and the cold corridor and the closed door of the Duchess's chamber, Isadora Pemberton lay in the dark in a room full of packed bags. And she was not sleeping either. He knew it the way one knows the weather before the window is opened. The manor breathed it. She was awake. And she was still here. Until morning, he reminded himself. He pressed his jaw again, set the quill down. Morning was still several hours away. He knocked on her door at 6:30 in the morning. Not because he had a plan, not because he had found the right words in the hours between midnight and dawn. He had found no words at all, only the same grey circle of thoughts, the same letter on the desk, the same silence pressing down from above. He knocked because morning had arrived, and with it the quiet certainty that if he did not move, she would. 3 seconds passed. Then, "Come in." Her voice was steady. Of course it was. He opened the door. Isadora stood beside the window in a dark travelling dress, her hair already pinned, her gloves folded over the back of the chair beside her. The trunk sat near the door, closed and fastened. A smaller bag rested beside it. She had been ready for hours. He could see it in the practiced stillness of her posture, the way someone stands when they have already finished leaving in their mind and are simply waiting for the body to follow. She looked at him, he looked at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment that lasted considerably longer than it should have. "Your Grace," she said finally. Not cold, not warm, simply precise, the way she said most things. "I would ask you to wait," he said. Something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly. More like the careful adjustment a person makes when they receive information they were not prepared for, but refuse to let show. Her chin lifted a fraction. "Wait," she repeated. "A week, perhaps 2. For what purpose?" He had prepared a reason. He had rehearsed it somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, standing at the study window with the dark garden below him, and the words arranging themselves in his head with the clean logic he always relied on. Something about the accounts, the East Wing repairs, a practical reason, a sufficient reason. Standing in front of her now, with the early light coming through the window and touching the edge of her jaw, every word of it felt precisely wrong. "The accounts are mid-quarter," he said. "Your departure now would leave the household without adequate oversight during a critical period." The silence that followed was brief and absolute. "The accounts," she said. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, a quiet, internal recalibration that he recognized because he had seen it before, in the early months, when she first arrived and spent the first weeks measuring the distance between who he was and what she had signed herself into. "Very well," she said. 2 weeks. She did not reach for her gloves. The days that followed were unlike any that had come before them. Something had changed in the architecture of their silence. It carried the same surface, the formal dinners, the brief exchanges in the corridor, the careful distance maintained across every room, but the weight beneath it was different now, heavier, more aware of itself. They both felt it, neither acknowledged it. It was Isadora who broke the pattern first, though not intentionally. On the 4th day, a problem emerged with the drainage on the north field. The estate manager, Mr. Graves, came to Dorian in the late morning with a set of plans and a concern about the coming rain season. Dorian stood over the plans on the study table, frowning at a section near the old mill. When the door opened and Isadora walked in, carrying, of all things, an older set of drainage surveys from the Manor's records room that she had evidently retrieved on her own initiative. She stopped when she saw him. He looked up. "Mrs. Alcott mentioned the issue this morning," she said simply. "I found the original surveys from 1841. There was a similar problem then. The solution is noted in the margin." She set the papers on the table beside Mr. Graves's plans, turned to leave, and then paused. "The old channel runs further east than the current maps suggest. That may be relevant." She left. Mr. Graves looked at the old survey, then at Dorian. "She's right, Your Grace. Look, right here." He pointed to a penciled note in the margin, faded but legible. The 1841 solution held for 30 years. Dorian looked at the doorway through which Isadora had just walked. He said nothing. But that evening, for the first time since the morning she had decided to leave, he did not go to the study after dinner. He went to the library instead, and found her already there, seated near the fire with that French letters book open in her lap. She looked up when he entered. He crossed to the opposite chair and sat without explanation. She did not ask for one. He picked up the journal from the side table. He did not read a single word of it. For an hour they sat like that on opposite sides of the fire, in a silence that felt, for reasons Dorian could not have articulated without considerable difficulty, less like absence and more like presence. It was on the 7th day that they had their first real conversation. Not an exchange about accounts or repairs or household logistics. A conversation, the kind that begins as one thing and quietly becomes another without either person noticing until it has already happened. It started because of the rain. A sudden storm rolled in from the north that afternoon, the kind that arrives without warning, darkening the sky in the space of 20 minutes and sending sheets of water sideways across the windows. Dorian was returning from the stables when it broke, and he reached the covered walkway along the east garden just as the downpour hit, to find Isadora already there, standing with her arms crossed and watching the rain with an expression that was almost, but not quite, peaceful. He stood beside her. The rain was loud. "You like storms?" he said. It was not a question. He had noticed the way she stood, the slight release in her shoulders, as though the weather had given her permission to breathe differently. She glanced at him, mildly surprised, as she always was when he noticed something. "I find them honest," she said. "Honest. Everything stops pretending when it storms. The garden stops being decorative, the sky stops being polite." A pause. "I find that restful." He considered that. He looked at the rain hitting the stone path, breaking apart and running in streams between the old paving. There was something in what she said that he understood more than he expected to, and that understanding arrived in his chest before his mind had a chance to examine it first. "My father hated storms," he said. He did not know why he said it. He claimed they disrupted his schedule. Isadora turned her head slightly, not quite looking at him, but listening in that particular way she had, where her full attention arrived without any visible effort. "Did he keep a strict schedule?" "He kept a strict appearance of one, a beat. The reality was considerably less ordered." She was quiet for a moment, then carefully. "I think many people in positions of power are like that. The schedule is not about time. It is about the impression of control." He looked at her. She was still watching the rain. Her profile, the line of her jaw, the slight press of her lips, was composed and neutral and entirely unreadable, the way it usually was. But there was something in the observation that felt less like small talk and more like someone opening a door just a fraction, to see whether there was light on the other side. He almost said something. The kind of something that has no practical purpose, that serves no arrangement, that belongs to a conversation between two people who are more to each other than signatures on a contract. He stopped himself. But the word sat at the edge of his mouth for the rest of the storm, and for a long time after the rain had gone and the garden returned to its polite, decorative quiet, and he could not quite make it leave. The 2 weeks were nearly over. Dorian knew it the way he knew the weather, not by checking, but by a quiet internal register that had, without his permission, begun to track her time at Wycliffe Manor with uncomfortable precision. 12 days had passed since she agreed to stay. 2 remained. He had not raised the subject again, neither had she. But he noticed, and he was becoming, against his better judgment, a man who noticed a great deal where Isadora was concerned, that she had not resumed her packing. The trunk still sat in the corner of her room. He knew because the door to the Duchess's chamber had been left ajar one morning as he passed, and he had not looked inside. Not deliberately, but he had seen. The trunk had not moved. He did not allow himself to decide what that meant. It was Mrs. Alcott, the housekeeper, who said it first. She came to him on the 11th morning with a household matter, something to do with the linen inventory and a supplier in the village. And at the end of their exchange, as she gathered her papers to leave, she paused. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, with the careful tone of a woman who has served a household long enough to have earned one honest observation. "The manor runs better now than it has in 20 years. Dorian looked at her. "Her Grace?" Mrs. Alcott said simply, and left. He stood in the corridor for a moment after she was gone, his hand resting on the banister of the main staircase, looking at nothing in particular. The entrance hall below was swept and bright. The flowers in the tall vase near the door were fresh. The smell of beeswax and old wood that had always defined Wycliffe Manor had settled in recent weeks into something warmer, as though the house itself had exhaled. The manor runs better now than it has in 20 years. He had known it. He had known it for months, in the background of every room, in the quiet efficiency of every meal, in the fact that not a single problem had escalated to his desk since October, that Isadora had not already identified and begun to resolve. He had known it and filed it away under practical value, the same category where he had placed everything about her, because that category had walls and a lock and was considerably safer than the alternative. The alternative being that he had come to rely on her in ways that had nothing to do with the original agreement. He climbed the stairs slowly. The moment arrived on the 12th day, and it arrived quietly, the way the most significant things often do. Dorian had ridden out to the North Field in the late morning to check the progress on the drainage repair. The work was going well. The 1841 solution was holding exactly as Isadora's old survey had predicted. He stood at the edge of the field for a while, watching the men work, his horse standing patient behind him, and he felt something that he recognized distantly as satisfaction, the kind that has roots. When he returned to the manor, he went to find Mr. Graves to report his assessment. He found Isadora instead. She was in the small room beside the records library, a low-ceilinged space filled with estate maps and leather folders that no one had opened in years, seated at the narrow table with 3 ledgers open before her and a candle burning close, because the single window in the room faced north and the afternoon light was thin. She had taken off her outer jacket and draped it over the chair. Her sleeves were rolled precisely to the elbow. Her pen moved across the paper in front of her with a quick, considered certainty. She did not hear him in the doorway. He watched her for exactly 3 seconds longer than was appropriate. There was something about the way she worked, the complete absence of performance in it, the total lack of awareness that anyone might be watching, that he found difficult to look away from. Most people, when they applied themselves to a task, carried some residual awareness of the room around them. Isadora, when she was focused, was simply elsewhere, fully inside the work, as though the rest of the world had agreed to wait. He had never seen anyone so entirely themselves. He cleared his throat. She looked up. For a fraction of a second, barely enough to measure, gone before it could properly arrive, something unguarded crossed her face. Not alarm. Something softer than that. Then her expression settled back into its usual composure. "Your Grace," she set the pen down, "I did not hear you." "I can see that." He stepped into the room. "The drainage work is progressing. Your survey reference was correct. I assumed it would be. Not arrogance, simply fact." He looked at the open ledgers. "What are you working on?" A pause, small but present. "The inheritance accounts, from before our marriage." She kept her voice even. "There are some discrepancies I noticed in October that I never fully resolved. I thought, while I am still here—" She stopped. Let the sentence find its own ending. "While I am still here." The words landed in the room with more weight than either of them reached for. Dorian looked at the ledgers, then at her hands still resting on the open page, then, because he was standing close enough that the candlelight fell across them both, he looked at her face, and found her already looking at him with an expression so carefully arranged that the effort of it was itself visible. She looked away first. He pulled the chair from beside the table and sat down. "Show me the discrepancy," he said. She looked back at him. This time, whatever she felt did not reach her face at all. She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to a column of figures near the bottom of the page. He leaned forward to look. Their shoulders were perhaps 6 inches apart. Neither of them moved to increase the distance. They worked until the candle burned to its halfway point. It was not a dramatic afternoon. No declarations were made. No meaningful glances lingered past what could be explained. They sat at a narrow table in a dim room and went through 14 months of inheritance accounts with the focused attention of 2 people who are, whatever else they may be, exceptionally good at the work in front of them. But something shifted in that room. It was in the way Dorian reached across the table to point at a figure and did not immediately withdraw his hand. It was in the way Isadora explained her reasoning, quietly, without softening it or making it smaller to fit the space, and the way he listened without interrupting, his jaw slightly loose, his expression carrying something that was not quite professional attention and not quite something else. It was in the moment when she found the source of the discrepancy, a clerical error from a solicitor 3 years past, buried in a footnote, and said, "There," with a quiet certainty, and looked at him. And he looked at her, and said with a sincerity that arrived before he had cleared it through any internal filter at all, "You are remarkably good at this." Isadora was still for a moment, the kind of stillness that happens when a person receives something they were not prepared for and must decide very quickly whether to let it in. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was entirely controlled, but her fingers curled slightly on the edge of the page. He saw it. He said nothing. He looked back at the ledger, but something in his chest had quietly rearranged itself, and he was very aware, as he had not been fully aware before, that the 2 weeks he had asked her to stay were ending in 48 hours. and that he had no new reason to ask for more time. No practical reason. No account discrepancy. No drainage survey. No logical, defensible, contract-appropriate justification that would survive examination. Only the thing that sat behind his ribs when she said, "While I am still here." Quiet, persistent, and absolutely impossible to file under anything useful. He closed the ledger. "It is getting late," he said. "Yes," she agreed. They left the room separately, as they always did, but the corridor felt different afterward, as if the air between them had been rearranged by the afternoon and had not quite settled back into its old shape. The 2 weeks ended on a Tuesday. Isadora did not bring her trunk downstairs. Dorian did not ask why. They moved through the morning with the particular carefulness of two people who have made a silent, unspoken agreement to pretend that a deadline passed without consequence. The kind of agreement that requires no words, precisely because words would force a reckoning neither of them was prepared to have. She appeared at breakfast at her usual hour. He was already there. They exchanged observations about the weather and the progress of the North Field repair. Mrs. Alcott brought fresh bread and the morning correspondence. The fire in the dining room was warm. Outside, the March light came through the tall windows in long pale sheets and lay across the table between them like something neutral. It was, by all appearances, an ordinary morning. It was nothing of the sort. The letter arrived that afternoon. Not to Isadora, not to Dorian. It came addressed to Mr. Hale, his solicitor, forwarded from London with a note appended in Hale's careful hand. "I believe this requires your direct attention, Your Grace. It arrived at my office last week, among a collection of papers transferred from Pemberton's former solicitor upon his retirement. I forward it without alteration. Hale." Dorian opened it in his study. It was dated 18 months ago, 2 months before their marriage was arranged. The handwriting was formal, the language of a legal correspondence. It was a letter from Lord Pemberton's original solicitor to a third party, a Mr. Alderton, whom Dorian did not recognize, confirming that the terms of the late Lord Pemberton's will were unambiguous and entirely sound. He read it once without understanding why Hale had sent it. Then he reached the second page. "Miss Pemberton's inheritance is fully and irrevocably protected under the terms of the will, regardless of her marital status. The family name clause which Miss Pemberton cited in her inquiry of March last year does not, in fact, exist within the document. I have reviewed the will in its entirety and can confirm that no such condition was placed upon the inheritance. Miss Pemberton requires no marriage of any kind to maintain full legal possession of her estate and fortune." Dorian stopped reading. He went back to the beginning of the sentence and read it again. Then he set the letter down on the desk with great deliberateness, the way a man sets something down when the surface beneath him has just shifted and he needs a moment to establish where, exactly, solid ground now is. Miss Pemberton requires no marriage of any kind. She had told him, or rather her solicitor had presented it, that the marriage was necessary, that her inheritance required the protection of a title, of a suitable name, of a husband recognized by society. That was the foundation of the arrangement, the reason she had agreed, the reason the contract existed at all, except it was not true. There had been no clause, no condition, no threat to her fortune. She had come to him, had sat across from him in that drawing room in her deep blue gown and looked at him without flinching, not because she had to. She had come because she chose to. The room was very quiet. Dorian stood from his desk and walked to the window. The garden below was grey and still. A single crow sat on the garden wall, regarding the bare rose beds with the patient indifference of something that has nowhere particular to be. He thought about the morning of their first meeting, the particular quality of her gaze, measured, careful, as though she were assessing something she had already decided to accept and was simply confirming the decision. He had read it as practicality, as the composed calculation of a woman making the best available arrangement. He understood now that he had been looking at it from the wrong side. She had not been calculating what she needed. She had been deciding whether he was worth what she was about to give. And she had decided yes, for reasons she had never offered him, for reasons he had never thought, not once, not in 14 months of shared silence and careful distance and the growing inconvenient awareness of her presence in every room, to ask. His jaw tightened. He thought about the night she wrote the letter. "I have fulfilled every obligation this marriage required of me. He had read it as a formal termination of a formal contract. He understood now that it was something else entirely. A woman who had given more than the terms required and received nothing, beyond what the terms provided, finally deciding that enough was enough. He had married her for her fortune. She had married him for reasons she had kept entirely to herself. And he had spent 14 months being precisely as cold and distant and contractual as she had known, had apparently accepted that he would be. The crow on the garden wall took flight without warning. Dorian watched it go across the bare trees over the roofline out of sight and felt something move in his chest that he had no clean word for. Not guilt, closer to recognition, the particular uncomfortable recognition of a man who has been living inside a version of events that was never entirely real and who must now decide what to do with the one that is. He found her in the east corridor at 4:30. She was examining a crack in the plaster near the window frame, running her fingers along the edge of it with a focused, diagnostic attention, the kind of small, practical care she gave to everything in the manor without being asked. She did not hear him coming. He watched her for a moment, her gloved hand against the pale wall, her head tilted slightly, her brow faintly creased. Isadora. He had not called her by her name before. Not once in 14 months. It was always Your Grace or nothing at all. She turned, and for the first time since he had known her, he saw something in her face that she did not manage in time, a brief, unguarded thing, gone in a second, but real. The expression of a person who has just heard something they did not expect from a direction they were not watching. She recovered, her chin lifted. Your Grace, there is something I need to speak with you about. He paused. This evening, after dinner, if you are willing. She studied him for a moment with those careful eyes, looking, he now understood, not for what he was saying, but for what he was not. Of course, she said. He nodded, turned to leave. Dorian. He stopped. It was the first time she had used his name. He turned back. She was still looking at him, composed, yes, but with something beneath it that held its ground rather than retreating. A question she was not yet asking. A door left open by exactly the width of a word. Is everything all right? She asked. He held her gaze. No, he said honestly, but I believe it will be. He left her standing in the corridor beside the crack in the plaster, with the thin afternoon light coming through the window behind her, and his name still in the air between them. And for the first time in 11 years, the door he had closed in August did not feel as permanent as he had always believed it to be. The conversation after dinner did not happen. Not because either of them avoided it, not because the words were not there somewhere waiting to be spoken, but because at 7:30, before the dining-room chairs had been fully pushed back, Mrs. Alcott appeared in the doorway with a card on a silver tray and the careful expression of a woman delivering something she would rather not. Lord Ashby has arrived, Your Grace. He says the matter is urgent. Dorian looked at the card. Something in his jaw shifted. Lord Ashby, Gerald Ashby to be precise, was his mother's cousin, a man of 60 with a large estate in Hertfordshire, a larger opinion of himself, and a seat on 2 of the most powerful social committees in London. He was not a man who appeared unannounced at other people's houses without cause. Dorian looked across the table at Isadora. She had already folded her napkin and set it beside her plate. I will leave you to your guest, she said. Stay, he said. It came out more direct than he intended. She looked at him, that brief internal recalibration he was learning to read, and then stayed. Gerald Ashby walked into the drawing-room the way he walked into every room, as though he had been invited specifically by the room itself to take charge of it. He was broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and carried the permanent expression of a man who believes that bluntness is a virtue rather than a habit. Dorian. He extended his hand. Then he saw Isadora standing near the fireplace, and his expression shifted into the particular combination of approval and assessment that society men reserve for the wives of men they intend to influence. Your Grace. A precise bow. Forgive the hour. Lord Ashby, Dorian gestured to the chair. Sit down, tell me what brings you. Gerald sat. He accepted the glass that was offered, took a measured sip and set it on the table beside him with the deliberateness of a man organizing his thoughts into a presentation. I will be direct, he said. It is about the Whitfield appointment. Dorian was still. The Whitfield appointment was something that had been discussed in certain circles for several months, a significant position on the Privy Council's advisory board, one that carried both influence and obligation, and that had been quietly proposed for Dorian's consideration by men whose opinions moved things in London. He had neither accepted nor declined. He had, in the way he handled most things that did not require immediate action, simply waited. "There are those," Gerald said carefully, "who feel that the appointment should be confirmed before the spring session, and there are those, a smaller number but vocal, who have raised questions." "What kind of questions?" Gerald looked at him steadily. "About the marriage." The room was very quiet. Isadora, near the fireplace, did not move. Her hands were folded in front of her, still correct, composed. But Dorian, who had been learning for weeks to read the things she did not show, caught the faintest tightening at the edge of her jaw. "Elaborate," Dorian said. "There is a rumour," Gerald said, "that the Duchess intends to leave Wycliffe Manor, that the marriage is irregular, in nature." He paused. "These things travel. You know how London is. A servant speaks to a delivery man. A delivery man has a cousin with a loose tongue in the right parlour. Before the week is out, the story has grown into something considerably more damaging than whatever the truth of it may be." He looked at Isadora briefly, then back at Dorian. "I am not here to judge the private arrangements of your household, Dorian. I am here as a courtesy, to tell you that if there is instability in this marriage, it will be used against the appointment. And more than the appointment, the Mercer name is old enough to survive many things. But not public scandal, not at this particular moment, with this particular position at stake." He finished his glass, set it down, stood. "I trust I have been sufficiently direct," he said. And left, because Gerald Ashby had spent 60 years making entrances and exits at precisely the right moment, and tonight was no exception. The drawing-room held their silence for a long time after his footsteps faded down the corridor. Dorian stood at the mantelpiece, one hand resting on the edge of it, looking at the fire. Isadora had not moved from her position near the hearth. The space between them was perhaps 4 feet. It had never felt so precisely measured. "I apologize," Dorian said finally, "for the intrusion into your privacy." "It is not your fault that people talk," she said. Her voice was even. "It is, however, my fault that they have something to talk about." He looked at her. "That is not—" "I decided to leave," she said simply. "That decision had consequences I did not fully consider. I am considering them now." He studied her face. She was doing the thing she did, arranging her expression into perfect composure, holding it there like armor, keeping whatever was underneath entirely out of reach. He had accepted that arrangement for 14 months. He found tonight that he could not. "Isadora." He turned from the mantelpiece. "I received a letter this afternoon from Hale." She waited. "It concerned your father's will." He kept his voice measured. "There was no clause requiring marriage. Your inheritance was never at risk." The silence that followed was of a different quality from any that had come before. Not the waited, watchful quiet of their dinners or their evenings by the fire. This was the silence of something that has been held for a long time and has just been put down. Isadora looked at the fire. A single log shifted in the grate, sending a brief scatter of sparks upward and gone. "No," she said quietly. "There was not." He waited. She pressed her lips together for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was entirely controlled, but controlled the way a river is controlled by its banks, by the specific effort of having banks at all. "My solicitor was overzealous in his presentation of the terms. I did not correct him." "Why?" A long pause. "Because it was simpler," she said. "If the arrangement had a clear practical basis, neither of us would need to—" She stopped, began again. "I thought it would be cleaner, for both of us." "Cleaner," he repeated. "Less complicated." She looked at him then, directly, fully, the way she had on the morning of their very first meeting, when she had assessed him across a drawing-room and made a decision that he had spent 14 months misunderstanding. "You needed the estate saved. A breath. "I had my own reasons. I thought it was better if they remained mine." "And now?" The question arrived quietly, without strategy, without the careful premeditation he applied to most things. It came from the place that had been rearranging itself since the afternoon, since the letter, since the corridor, since the first time he said her name, and she had not managed to hide the thing that crossed her face before she could stop it. Isadora looked at him for a long moment. "Now," she said carefully, A man I barely know has arrived at our home to tell us that our marriage must appear stable for the sake of your reputation. And I find myself—" She paused. "I find myself uncertain whether to feel more offended by his presumption or by the fact that he may have a point." Dorian almost said something. Not the rational, practical reputation management something. The other something. The one that had been sitting at the edge of his mouth since the rain, since the records room, since while I am still here. The one that had no contractual basis and no defensible position and served no purpose beyond the truth of it. He stopped himself. "Old habit, old door, old cost. I will send word to London," he said instead, addressing the rumours. "It will require us to appear together at the Hathaway reception next Friday. It is the appropriate venue, visible enough without being obvious." He paused. "If that is acceptable to you." Isadora held his gaze for exactly 1 beat longer than was necessary. "And then it is acceptable." She moved to leave. At the door she stopped, not turning fully, just enough that he could see the line of her jaw, the set of her shoulders. Dorian. His name again. Still new in her mouth, still doing something to the air when she said it. "Whatever reason you have decided upon for asking me to stay." A pause. "I hope, eventually, you will find the courage to say the actual one." She left. The fire crackled. The room held her words. And Dorian Mercer stood at the mantelpiece in the home she had quietly rebuilt, with the reputation she had not needed to protect, and understood, with the slow, irreversible clarity of a man who has run out of practical reasons, that the door he closed 11 years ago was no longer entirely his to keep shut. The Hathaway reception was on a Friday. They arrived together as agreed. Isadora in deep green silk, her hair pinned with quiet precision, a single strand of pearls at her throat. Dorian in black, his posture correct, his expression carrying that particular composure that London society had always read as authority, and that was, in truth, simply the face of a man who had spent his entire adult life keeping the inside of himself entirely out of view. They were received well. Of course they were. Society reads surfaces, and the surface they presented that evening was flawless, a duke and duchess of old name and steady manner, moving through the candle-lit rooms with the unhurried ease of people who have nothing to prove. Lady Hathaway greeted them warmly, and kept Isadora for 20 minutes, which was a good sign. Lord Whitfield, the man whose appointment had everything to do with Dorian being in this room, shook his hand and made a remark about the North Estate repair that suggested Gerald Ashby had already done his work. 3 separate people told Dorian that his wife was charming, which he acknowledged with a nod and did not discuss further. Isadora was not charming in the way that draws attention. She was something quieter and more permanent than that. She listened when people spoke to her, fully, without the fractional distraction that most people carry in social rooms. She remembered the name of Lady Forsyth's daughter, which she had heard mentioned once in passing 2 months ago. She made a quiet observation about the Hathaway Portrait Gallery that made the host's elderly father laugh for the first time in what appeared to be quite a while. Dorian watched her from across the room. He did not mean to watch her, but she had a way of being present in a space that his attention found without being directed there, the way the eye finds the single lit window in an otherwise dark facade, not because it is dramatic, but because it is real. At one point their eyes met across the length of the drawing room. She held his gaze for a moment, composed, unreadable. Then someone spoke to her, and she turned away, and Dorian looked down at the glass in his hand and understood, with a sudden and unwelcome clarity, that he was in a great deal of trouble. They rode home in silence. Not the comfortable silence of the library, or the weighted silence of the study, or even the careful silence of their formal dinners. This was a newer kind, a silence that knew something, that had been present in the Hathaway drawing room and had climbed into the carriage with them and sat between them on the short bench of dark space separating their shoulders. The horses moved through the night. The road was quiet. The lamps inside the carriage threw a low amber light across Isadora's hands in her lap, across the line of her profile as she looked out the window at the passing dark. Dorian looked at the opposite window and said nothing. When they arrived at Wycliffe Manor and the footman opened the carriage door, he helped her down. His hand under hers, the brief warmth of it through her glove, gone the moment she stepped onto the gravel. She thanked him without looking at him. He released her hand with an unhurried deliberateness that cost him more than it should have. In the entrance hall, she paused at the base of the stairs. "It went well, I think," she said. "Yes," he agreed. Lord Whitfield seemed satisfied. "He did." She nodded once, her hand on the banister, and began to climb. 3 steps up, she stopped without turning. "Good night, Dorian." "Good night," he said. He watched her until the landing took her from view. Then he stood alone in the entrance hall for a long time, in the house that smelled of beeswax and the faint residue of her lavender, and did the thing he had been doing for 11 years. He went to the study, sat down at the desk, and tried to think. He did not sleep well that week, not because anything had changed in the visible structure of their days. They were, on the surface, exactly what they had been before the Hathaway reception. The dinners were quiet, the mornings were occupied. The household ran with the same quiet efficiency that Isadora brought to everything without effort or announcement. But something had shifted in him that he could not shift back. It was a small thing in its way, no single moment he could point to, more like a slow accumulation: the drainage survey, the records room, the storm, her name in his mouth, her words at the door of the drawing room. All of it had been building, quietly and without his consent, into a weight that he could no longer explain as practical inconvenience. He had told himself for 11 years that the closed door was a choice, that he had simply decided after Charlotte that the particular cost of wanting something and losing it was a cost he was not willing to pay again. It had felt, for a long time, like wisdom. The kind of wisdom that is indistinguishable from self-protection when you are 23 and in pain, and that becomes a habit so deeply set that by 34 you have stopped noticing it is there at all. Isadora had not broken through it. She had done something more inconvenient than that. She had simply lived alongside it, with enough composure and enough quiet reality, until the door had become visible again. "I hope eventually you will find the courage to say the actual one." He had not slept well since she said that. On Wednesday morning he made a decision. Not the right one. He would understand that later, but it was the only decision available to a man who has spent 11 years choosing structure over feeling and is not yet ready, in the full and honest sense, to stop. He rode to London. He told himself it was for the Whitfield matter. There were papers to sign, meetings to attend, legitimate business that had accumulated. All of that was true. He made the arrangements efficiently, informed Mr. Graves of his absence, left brief instructions with Mrs. Alcott, and did not go to find Isadora before he left. He told himself she did not need an explanation. They were, after all, still a formal arrangement, whatever else they had become in the space between. She was free with her time. He owed her courtesy, not accounting. He told himself that every mile of the road to London. He did not entirely believe it by the time he arrived. London was busy and familiar, and entirely without the particular quality of silence that he had grown, without meaning to, dependent upon. He attended his meetings. He signed the necessary papers. He dined with Whitfield's associate and said the correct things in the correct order. He walked through the city in the evenings and found himself more than once stopped on a pavement without clear reason, looking at a bookshop window, or a vase of flowers outside a florist, or the particular way rain moved across old stone, and thinking about the narrow records room at Wycliffe Manor and the smell of an opened ledger and the way she said there when she found what she was looking for. On the 4th day, a letter arrived from Mr. Graves, a routine update on the estate, nothing requiring urgent attention. Dorian read it at his London desk and turned it over, looking at the blank side of the paper for a moment before setting it down. On the 5th day, nothing arrived. On the 6th day, he received a note from Mrs. Alcott about a repair to the kitchen roof that could wait. He read it, set it beside the first letter, looked at them both. Neither of them was from Isadora. He had not written to her either. He was aware of that. He sat at the London desk in the London room, with the London noise coming through the window, cartwheels, voices, a church bell counting out the hour, and thought, with the slow and undeniable honesty of a man who has run out of other options, this is what you chose. This is what the closed door looks like from the other side. Cold, correct, entirely his own. He had built this. Every wall of it, every careful distance, every practical reason carefully laid in place of a real one. He had built it at 23, and maintained it at 34, and called it wisdom, and called it strength, and stood inside it every day of his adult life without understanding what it had actually cost, until a woman with dark hair and a quiet intelligence, and the particular dignity of someone who never asks for more than is freely given, had come to live inside it with him. And even then he had needed 6 days alone in London to understand what he already knew. He looked at the window. The London sky was pale and uncertain, the way it is in early spring, not quite winter anymore, not yet willing to commit to anything warmer. He thought about Wycliffe Manor, the bare rose beds coming slowly back, the East Garden at dawn, the library fire at evening. He thought about the trunk in the corner of her room, still unpacked, still there. He thought about how long it would stay. He left London on a Thursday morning. No letter sent ahead, no announcement of his return. He simply told his man to prepare the carriage at 7, settled the outstanding business from the night before, and was on the road to Wycliffe Manor before the city had fully woken. The drive took 4 hours. For the first 2, he sat with his hands on his knees and looked out the window at the passing countryside, in the particular way of a man rehearsing something, turning the words over, testing their weight, checking them for the kind of structural weakness that lets a feeling collapse under examination. He had always been good at that, finding the flaw, keeping things at the level of the manageable. By the 3rd hour, he had stopped rehearsing. There was nothing to rehearse. That was what he understood now, finally, with the patience that had taken 11 years and 6 days in London to fully arrive. The thing he wanted to say to Isadora was not a speech. It was not a proposition or a renegotiation of terms, or a careful statement of revised contractual intentions. It was something far simpler than any of that, and far more difficult, because it required him to say exactly what he meant, without the architecture of practicality to stand behind. He had never done that. Not since August 11 years ago, when a door closed inside him and he decided that being that open was simply not a cost worth paying. He understood now what that decision had actually been. Not wisdom, not strength, just fear. The carriage turned through the gates of Wycliffe Manor in the early afternoon. The drive was lined with the old oaks, their branches just beginning at the very tips, to carry the first suggestion of green. Not yet spring, but no longer entirely winter. Something in between, tender and uncertain, committing slowly to warmth. Dorian looked at it through the carriage window and felt something in his chest release. A pressure he had carried so long he had stopped registering it as weight. He was home. Mrs. Alcott met him in the entrance hall with the expression of a woman who is relieved and has decided not to say so. "Welcome back, Your Grace." She took his coat. "Her Grace is in the East Garden." He nodded, did not go to the study, did not stop to review the correspondence on the hall table, did not do any of the things he usually did upon returning to the manor, the small rituals of arrival that had always served, he understood now, as a delay. A way of being back without fully being present. He went directly to the East Garden. She was by the old stone bench near the far wall, crouched at the edge of the rosebed with a pair of gardening gloves on, and a basket beside her, doing something careful and unhurried to the base of one of the older bushes. The afternoon light was soft and even. A blackbird somewhere in the nearby elm was making an unreasonable amount of noise about the spring. She did not hear him on the grass. He stopped a few feet behind her and simply looked at her for a moment, at the composed, unhurried way she moved, at the slight tilt of her head as she examined what she was doing, at the dark hair pinned at her neck with a single pin that had come slightly loose and let a strand fall forward along her jaw. 14 months, he thought. 14 months of this woman being exactly herself in every room of this house, asking nothing, giving everything, and waiting with a patience that he had not deserved and had not, until now, been honest enough to acknowledge. "Isadora." She turned. And there it was again, that brief, unguarded thing that crossed her face when she was not quite prepared. This time he did not look away from it. He let himself see it fully, the flicker of something warm and careful and held very tightly, the thing she never allowed to stay long enough to be named. She stood, pulled off one glove. "You are back." "Yes." She looked at him, that measured, careful look, assessing as always, deciding as always how much to let in. "How was London?" "Lonely," he said. She was still. He had not planned that word. It arrived without permission, the way things do when a man stops rehearsing and simply speaks. But it was the right word, the only accurate one. And he watched it land. watched the careful arrangement of her expression hold for a moment, and then very slightly begin to loosen at the edges. "I owe you a conversation," he said. "The one I avoided the evening Lord Ashby came, and every evening before that, if I'm being honest." He paused. "I would like to be honest now, if you will allow it." She said nothing, but she did not look away. He took a breath. "When I asked you to stay the first time, the morning you had packed your trunk, I told you it was for the accounts, the household oversight, the quarterly transition." He held her gaze. "That was not the reason." The blackbird in the elm had gone quiet. "The reason," he said, "was that I stood in the entrance hall the night before with your letter in my hand and heard through the ceiling the sound of your trunk being closed. And something happened that I was not prepared for and could not explain, and spent the following 6 months refusing to examine." He paused, "until London made it unavoidable." Isadora's hand, the one still holding the gardening glove, was very still. "I closed a door 11 years ago," he said. "I told myself it was wisdom. I told myself it was the appropriate response to a particular kind of pain. And for a long time it worked, because nothing came along that was worth the cost of opening it." He stopped. Let the next words come slowly, correctly, from the place he had not spoken from in over a decade. "And then you came and sat across from me in a drawing room in a blue dress, and looked at me as though you had already made your decision, and within 6 months I could not sit in a room you had recently left without being aware that you were gone." She looked at him. He had never seen her look quite like that, not composed, not arranged, not carefully managed, simply present, simply herself, standing in the garden with one glove on, and a strand of hair loose along her jaw, and every guard she carried laid quietly aside. "You chose this," he said, "not for duty, not for a clause that did not exist. You chose it for your own reasons, which you kept to yourself because you thought it was cleaner, and I was so committed to my own distance that I gave you 14 months of it and called it an acceptable arrangement." His jaw tightened briefly. "It was not acceptable. You deserved better from the beginning." A beat of silence. "I am not offering you a renegotiation," he said. "I am not proposing revised terms. I am telling you—" He stopped, started again, because this part required the most precision of all. "I am telling you that somewhere between a drainage survey and a thunderstorm, and a very small room full of ledgers, I stopped being a man who had a practical arrangement with a duchess. And I am asking, not as a contractual obligation, not as a matter of reputation or duty or family name, I am simply asking whether there is any part of you that might be willing to stay. Not for the manor, not for the accounts." He looked at her directly, fully, without any of the careful deflection he had spent a lifetime perfecting. "For me." The garden was perfectly still. Isadora looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he felt the full weight of the question hanging between them, and did not reach for it, and did not look away. He let it stay. He had earned the waiting. Then she crossed the distance between them. She did not run. She simply walked, 2 steps, 3, and stopped close enough that he could see the precise shade of her eyes in the afternoon light, grey and warm and entirely unguarded, for the first time since he had known her. "I married you," she said quietly, "because I sat across from you in that drawing room and watched you try to be practical about something that was making you miserable, and I thought—" A breath. "I thought that a man who carries that much quietly, without complaint, without explanation, is either very strong or very alone." Her chin lifted slightly. "I hoped it was both, because both, I understood." He was still. "I did not expect to be right about you," she said. "I expected the arrangement to be sufficient. I expected to do my part and keep my distance and find it enough." Something shifted in her face. The last of it, the final, carefully held thing releasing all at once, like a window opened after a long winter. It was not enough. It stopped being enough rather quickly, and I spent 14 months pretending otherwise because you had not asked me to stop. "I am asking now," he said. His voice was low. "I am asking you to stop pretending." She looked at him, everything she had kept so carefully contained, all of it finally openly present in her face. "I already have," she said. He reached up and tucked the loose strand of hair gently back from her jaw, his hand barely grazing her cheek, slow and deliberate. And she closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, the way a person does when something they have waited a long time for finally arrives without condition. When she opened them, he was still looking at her, and then he kissed her. Not urgently, not with the momentum of 14 months finally released all at once, but with the quiet, decided certainty of a man who has chosen something fully, without reservation, and wants her to feel the difference. She kissed him back with the same certainty, and the blackbird in the elm, apparently satisfied, began to sing again. They did not leave the garden for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the old stone wall in long, slow degrees, shifting from pale gold to the softer amber of early evening. They sat on the bench together, not performing composure, not maintaining distance, not managing the space between them into something contractually appropriate. Simply together, in the quiet way of people who have arrived somewhere they did not entirely expect to find and have recognized it, unmistakably, as home. She told him about the inheritance. All of it. Not just the clause that did not exist, but the reason she had been looking for a marriage at all. A father she had loved who worried in his final months that she would spend her life alone because she asked too much of people. That she was, in his gentle and well-meaning words, too composed for most men to reach. He was not wrong, she said. He was not entirely right, Dorian said. She looked at him and smiled, the real one, the one that reached her eyes and changed her whole face, and that he understood, in that moment, he would spend the rest of his life being glad he had not missed. Years later, when people asked the Duchess of Wycliffe how she had known through 14 months of silence and careful distance and a marriage built on paper, that it would become what it became, she always gave the same answer. He asked me to stay, she said, and for the first time I believed he meant it. The gardens of Wycliffe Manor were always best in summer. The roses along the east wall came back every June, with an insistence that seemed almost personal. Deep red and pale cream, climbing the old stone the way they had for 100 years, filling the morning air with something warm and persistent. The oaks along the drive were full and green. The fountain in the south courtyard, restored the year after the drainage work, caught the afternoon light and held it. And on the lawn on any given summer morning, 2 children ran between the rose beds, with the absolute conviction of people who have never once doubted that the world was made for them. A dark-haired girl of 4, who had inherited her mother's composure and her father's eyes, and a boy of 2 who had inherited, seemingly, everyone's stubbornness and no one's patience. Dorian watched them from the garden bench, his arm around Isadora's shoulders, her head resting lightly against him. The girl stopped at the edge of the rosebed, turned and looked at her father with an expression of complete seriousness. "Papa," she announced, "Thomas ate the dirt again." "Did he?" Dorian said. "He did." "And what did you do?" She considered this. "I told him it was not a biscuit." Sound advice. She nodded, satisfied, and ran back to her brother with the focused urgency of a 4-year-old who has important corrective work to do. Isadora laughed. The quiet, full laugh that he had learned over time was the most honest sound she made. He pressed his lips to her hair. She turned slightly, looked up at him. "You should have seen your face," she said, "the morning I packed that trunk." "I was perfectly composed," he said. "You were terrified." "I was," he said, "entirely." She looked at him the way she always did, with the steady, unguarded warmth of a woman who had chosen him before he had chosen himself, and had waited with extraordinary patience for him to catch up. He thought, not for the first time, that it was the greatest fortune the Mercer name had ever acquired. Not the inheritance, not the restored estate, not the appointment or the reputation, or any of the things that Lord Ashby had arrived to protect. Her, simply entirely her. And if stories like this touch your heart, subscribe to the channel. There are many more waiting to be told.